Few places in the world guarantee you safety, but one place that most people expect to be safe is at home with their spouse. We spend so much time at home, relaxing, watching TV, enjoying time with our loved ones. So much so that it's easy to forget that the family unit isn't always a safe place for everyone. For some, it's quite the opposite, as we will see today. In February 1988, in a quiet high-rise apartment in Hong Kong's Quarry Bay neighborhood, a 29-year marriage ended in violence, and what happened afterward would become one of Hong Kong's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. This is the Kornhill Garden murder. On the afternoon of February 23, 1988, around 3 p.m., a 28-year-old woman named Fu Mei Ling returned home to her family's apartment in Kornhill Garden, Quarry Bay. It was a newly built private estate on Hong Kong Island, 10 high-rise blocks in a quiet neighborhood. When she walked in, she found her mother kneeling in the dark on the floor of one of the bedrooms. Ma Kee-chi was wiping blood off the ground, occasionally dabbing at her nose. It looked like she'd had a nosebleed. When Fu Meiling asked what had happened, Ma Kee-chi stopped what she was doing, looked up at her daughter, and said, "Your father wanted to suffocate me with a blanket, and I beat him to death with a hammer." Then she went back to wiping the floor. Fu Meiling didn't know what to make of her mother's words. Her parents had been married for 29 years, and they fought constantly, but lately, the arguments had intensified. Her father had been having an affair with a younger woman, and her mother was furious. Fu Meiling couldn't believe that her mother had really murdered her father, assuming instead that her words were just an exaggeration born from resentment. But a month went by, and her father still hadn't returned. In the past, no matter how bad the fight, Fu Tong would always come back eventually. Now, he was just gone. He hadn't called, hadn't shown up at work, hadn't contacted anyone at all. And when Fu Meiling asked her mother where he was, she kept giving the same answer. "I beat him to death with a hammer." It wasn't until Fu Meiling's uncle, her father's brother, came by asking about Fu Tong that she started feeling genuinely uneasy. He said he hadn't heard from his brother in weeks and was getting worried. This revelation prompted her to consult with a lawyer, telling him about the red traces she'd seen in the apartment and the shocking statement that her mother kept repeating. The lawyer advised her to go to the police. On March 31st, 1988, at 5 p.m., Fu Meiling walked to the North Point police station with that lawyer by her side, ready to make a report. And that was the beginning of the Kornhill Garden murder of 1988, one of Hong Kong's strangest cases, a murder prosecution that took place even though the body was never found. To understand what happened, you need to first understand the breakdown of the marriage. Ma Kee-chi had fallen in love and married Fu Tong when she was still a young woman, seeing him as everything she wanted in a husband: responsible, hardworking, devoted. They had 2 daughters together. The elder Fu Meiling grew up to work as a secretary at a trading company and still lived with her parents at the time of the incident. The younger daughter had gotten married and moved to the United States. At the start, they seemed to have a wonderful marriage, but there was a problem that never went away. Ma Kee-chi never gave birth to a son. In traditional Chinese culture, this matters enormously. Fu Tong was the only son in his family, and he was under tremendous pressure from his parents to continue the family line. As the years passed without a male heir, that pressure became a weight that crushed the marriage. Ma tried everything. She took vitamins, tried traditional Chinese medicine, did everything she could think of to increase her chances of having a boy. But that is not how biology works. The sex of a child is determined by the father's genetic contribution. It's not something a mother can control by any means. Still, she tried, she prayed, she hoped. After their second daughter was born, the pressure from Futong's family intensified. Futong himself began to change. The loving gaze he once gave his wife had disappeared. He started insulting her, not just in private, but in front of family and friends. In arguments, he would frequently bring up her failure to produce a son, weaponizing it against her. When the insults weren't enough, he started hitting her, a slap here, a kick there. If she did anything that upset him, even the smallest thing, he would lash out. And he would always find a way to bring the conversation back to the son she'd never given him. Some of Ma's friends and acquaintances knew about the abuse. They told her to leave, to divorce Futong and go back to her own family. But the psychological damage had already been done. Years of being told she was worthless, that she had failed as a wife, had worn her down. Instead of blaming Futong for the abuse, Ma blamed herself, blamed her own body for not giving him what he wanted. But there was also a practical problem holding her back. Ma was a housewife. She had no job, no income of her own. How would she support herself and her daughters? She'd watched Fu Meiling as a child, cowering in a corner, trembling and crying during one of Futong's outbursts. That image stayed with her. She couldn't put her daughters through more upheaval, and she couldn't provide for them on her own. So she stayed. She swallowed her pain and told herself things would get better. They didn't. Years passed, her youth faded, and she became an ordinary middle-aged housewife who cooked and cleaned for a husband who despised her. Futong's abuse continued, but now there was something else too. He had started spending nights away from home. At first, Ma might have hoped he was just out drinking with friends, but she soon learned the truth. Futong had found himself a mistress, a younger woman, someone around their daughter's age, who had apparently promised to give him what Ma never could: a son. Ma confronted him about it every time he came home, demanding to know where he'd been. Her concern wasn't just for herself. If the neighbors found out her father was a cheater, they would gossip. Ma's second daughter was already in the US, but she worried about Fu Meiling. If the information got out, people would call her daughter names and insult them everywhere they went. But Futong didn't apologize or promise to change. He'd stopped caring what she thought a long time ago. After countless arguments, Ma made a decision. She told Futong she wanted a divorce. His response surprised her. Despite having a young, beautiful mistress who'd given him the son he always wanted, Futong refused. He didn't want to lose the wife who cooked and cleaned for him. And he definitely didn't want to divide his assets. In a divorce, he'd had to give Ma her share of what they'd built together. So Futong did something else instead. He moved out of the family home and went to live with his mistress, but he refused to sign divorce papers. He made the affair completely public. He brought his mistress to formal occasions, introducing her as a partner, while Ma sat at home, humiliated. The stress and anger built up inside Ma until something broke. She literally started hearing a voice in her head, a voice calling her name, telling her there was only one way to end this. She needed to punish her husband. Ma Kichi called her younger brother, Ma Xian-kun, crying. She told him everything: the decades of abuse, the affair, the public humiliation, Futong's refusal to grant her a divorce. And her brother was furious. He agreed to help her confront Futong and demand the compensation she deserved. Ma Xian-kun recruited two friends to help, Liang Jiezhi and Shi Zhiming, promising them each 8,000 Hong Kong dollars for their participation. The plan was to stage a robbery, scare Fu Tong, tie him up, and demand the 200,000 Hong Kong dollars that Fu Tong had recently gained from a property sale. They would also demand that he end his affair. On the night of February 21st, Fu Tong took his sleeping pills as usual, and Ma waited for him to fall asleep. Then she led her brother and his 2 accomplices into the apartment. The men tied Fu Tong's arms and legs to the frame of a bunk bed, covered his eyes with tape, and gagged him. When he came to, groggy from the sleeping pills, they made their demands. And Fu Tong refused. He wouldn't pay 200,000 Hong Kong dollars, and he wouldn't leave the other woman. The 3 men weren't prepared for this. They weren't professional criminals. They hadn't even brought weapons. Grasping at straws, they tried threatening him with a knife, keeping him tied up and even starving him for a couple of days, hoping he would break. Ma Xian-kun thought that a little fear and hunger might make Fu Tong more cooperative, but it didn't work. After a couple of days of getting nowhere, the 3 men gave up and just left. Ma and her husband were alone. Despite everything Fu Tong had done, Ma still felt something for him. They'd been married for almost 3 decades. She was worried about him. He'd been tied up for days without proper food. So she made him a bowl of congee with broth, his favorite, and went to feed him. Fu Tong begged her to untie his hand so he could eat. She loosened the rope on one of his hands and gave him the bowl. The moment his hand was free, Fu Tong grabbed the bowl and threw it at her, congee and all. He was furious, accusing her of conspiring with her relatives to rob him. Days of being tied up and starved had weakened him, so his blows didn't land as hard as they might have, but he punched and kicked her anyway, his rage overcoming his exhaustion. Faced with such aggression and violence, Ma just snapped. All those years of abuse, all that accumulated rage and pain came flooding out at once. She grabbed a hammer that was nearby and swung it at him. She kept swinging, screaming, and crying, hitting him again and again until he stopped moving. When it was over, blood was everywhere, on the cabinets, on the curtains, on the ceiling, on the kitchen floor. The bedroom looked like a slaughterhouse. Makichi just stood there, looking at her husband's body. Then, according to the confession she later made to the police, she calmed down. She looked at the blood pooling around him and thought, I need to clean this up before it soaks into the furniture. She sent her maid out to buy a chainsaw. Her plan was to cut up the body and dispose of it in pieces. She started with what she thought would be the easiest places, the joints. But when the chainsaw hit flesh, blood sprayed everywhere, even more than during the killing itself. The blood vessels in a freshly dead body still hold blood, and the chainsaw sent it flying across the room. So she put down the chainsaw and switched to a handsaw, slower but more controlled. She dismembered the body piece by piece. Then came the problem of disposal. She couldn't just throw body parts in the garbage. They would bleed, they would smell, and someone would notice. So she came up with an alternative solution. She filled a large cooking pot with water and boiled the body parts until there was no more blood coming from them. Some pieces she baked in the oven. When asked later why she did this, she answered matter-of-factly, so the blood would stop seeping out and the smell wouldn't fill the room. Unsurprisingly, Ma's pot wasn't big enough to hold an entire adult body, so she worked in batches. 6 or 7 pots worth, she later said. She worked through the day and into the night, cooking her husband's remains. She told the court that even during this process, the voice in her head, the one that had first told her to punish her husband, wouldn't stop. It kept commenting on what she was doing. but she felt satisfied with the result. The cooked meat didn't look human anymore. It was too dried out. No one would know what it was. She put the remains into multiple garbage bags and disposed of them at the Saiwanho garbage station. Then she turned her attention to the apartment. She scrubbed the blood off the floor, the walls, every surface she could reach. Some stains were too stubborn. They'd soaked into the bed and carpet. Instead of wasting more time trying to remove them, she covered them with red ink. After doing all she could to conceal the crime, she hired people to remove the furniture and all of Futong's belongings. By the time she was finished, the apartment was bare. The only proof Futong had ever existed was a photocopy of his ID card that Ma kept. A few weeks later, after the murder but before Fu Meiling's police report, Ma suddenly changed her story. Instead of saying that she'd killed Fu Meiling's father with a hammer, she told her daughter that Fu Tong and his mistress were trying to kill her. Ma and Fu Meiling moved together to a new apartment on Swato Street in Wanchai. 1 a.m. on April 1st, 1988, just hours after Fu Meiling made her police report. Officers arrested Ma Kichi at the Swato Street apartment in Wanchai. She was 58 years old, thin and small, and clearly in a fragile mental state. At first, she refused to cooperate, hiding in the bathroom and refusing to speak. But after some encouragement, Ma began to talk, and when she started, everything came out. She confessed to killing her husband. She described the kidnapping, the fight, the hammer, the dismemberment, and the cooking. And she explained her reasoning for each step. What struck the investigators wasn't just the content of her confession, it was her demeanor. She spoke calmly and matter-of-factly, as if she were describing a household chore rather than the killing and dismemberment of her husband of 29 years. 3 forensic technicians were sent to the apartment to find evidence corroborating Ma's account of events, and they found it completely empty. There was no furniture, no body, no visible evidence of violence, just bare walls and floors. But when they looked closer with specialized equipment, they discovered what Ma had tried to hide. There were traces of blood on the bedroom cabinets, on the curtains, on the walls, on the ceiling, and on the kitchen floor. The stains were too small and faint to be detected by the human eye, but they were there. The problem was that in 1988, Hong Kong didn't have DNA testing technology. The forensic team could, at best, determine the blood type of the victim, but the samples were so tiny that they struggled even to achieve this. They couldn't prove the blood belonged to Fu Tong. It could have come from anyone. Police arrested Ma Xiankun, who turned himself in, along with Liang Jiezhi and Shi Zhiming. The case first went before the magistrate's court on April 4th, 1988, where Ma Kichi and her brother Ma Xiankun appeared. Liang Jiezhi and Shi Zhiming appeared on April 8th. On June 1st, 1988, the prosecution dropped charges against Liang Jiezhi and Shi Zhiming. Shi because he'd become a prosecution witness in exchange for immunity, and Yang because the evidence against him was insufficient. Ma Xiankun was charged with unlawful imprisonment. In Ma Kichi's case, the magistrate's court ruled on June 12 that there was a prima facie evidence, meaning at face value, there was enough evidence for the case to proceed. So it was referred to the High Court. Throughout the proceedings, Ma Kichi's behavior was a matter of public debate. Some interpreted her calm, seemingly emotionless demeanor as evidence that she felt no remorse for the killing. Others suspected that she may have mental health issues severe enough to prevent her from understanding what was happening. 2 psychiatrists testified for the defense, explaining that Ma had suffered from paranoid schizophrenia for over 20 years. she heard voices that commented on everything she did, including during the killing and dismemberment of her husband. This argument was supported by Ma's own testimony, which kept changing. At first, she confessed to killing Fu Tong, but then she denied it, claiming Fu Tong had just run away with his mistress. This inconsistency suggested her grasp on reality was unreliable. Still, she was found fit to stand trial. On October 4th, 1988, the High Court trial reached its conclusion. The presiding judge, Justice Bailey, gave careful instructions to the jury. Given Ma's diminished responsibility at the time of the crime, she could not be charged with murder. Instead, they should consider whether she was guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. And since there was no body to prove Fu Tong's death, the judge also told the jury they needed to answer a fundamental question. Was Fu Tong actually dead, or had he simply disappeared? The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, they voted 5-2 to convict Ma Kichi of manslaughter. Ma was ordered to be detained indefinitely at Siulam Psychiatric Center. When the verdict was read, Ma showed no reaction. Her daughter, Fu Meiling, wept from the gallery. 3 days later, on October 7th, 1988, Ma Kichi's brother, Ma Xiankun, appeared for sentencing. He had pleaded guilty to unlawfully imprisoning Fu Tong. Considering Ma Xiankun's desire to protect his sister and the low likelihood of him reoffending, the judge sentenced him to 2 years in prison, suspended for 2 years. Ma Xiankun walked free that day. The case was closed, but the questions lingered. If Ma Kichi was truly unable to distinguish reality from fantasy, how did she plan so methodically? She arranged for 3 men to help kidnap her husband. Then the chainsaw proved too messy. She switched to a handsaw. She figured out how to cook the body parts to prevent smell and stop blood from flowing out, and covered stubborn stains with red ink. She hired people to remove the furniture. She kept only a copy of Fu Tong's ID to make it look like Pete simply left. This don't seem to be the actions of someone disconnected from reality. And from a physical point of view, Ma was described as thin and small. Fu Tong was an adult man. Beating someone to death with a hammer, then dismembering and cooking an entire body takes physical strength and stamina. Could she really have done all of this by herself? These questions have never been definitively answered, but the case was considered solved. Ma Kichi spent 7 years at Siulam Psychiatric Center. At the end of 1995, doctors examined her condition and determined she had recovered enough to rejoin society. She was released, and since then, Ma and her daughter have disappeared into anonymity. The apartment where the killing took place, Block D, Unit 12 on a lower floor of Kornhill Garden, became one of Hong Kong's most notorious haunted houses. In August 1990, about 2 years after the case, a company purchased it, hoping to flip it for a profit. But that didn't happen. Once people learned the unit's history, no one wanted to buy it. The property was put up for auction in 1990 and again in 2000, but there were no takers. The stigma caused by this event was such that it affected the entire building for decades. People were afraid of living near a place where something so terrible had happened. They worried about bad energy, about ghosts. As of 2023, neighboring units in the same block were still selling for about 10% below market value. This case is often cited as an example of how a victim of abuse can become an abuser themselves. Many people understood Ma's position: decades of physical and emotional torment, public humiliation, and a husband who wouldn't let her go. But understanding doesn't mean condoning. Whatever Fu Tong did to her, what she did to him went beyond anything most people could comprehend. Whether Makichi was truly too mentally ill to be held responsible, or whether she knew exactly what she was doing, is something only she can answer. Someone was convicted of Fu Tong's murder, but technically, with the location of his body still a mystery, the case remains unsolved. Cases such as these are difficult to judge. So, do you side with a woman who suffered years of humiliation and abuse at the hands of her husband, or with a husband who was brutally murdered and whose remains were never found? Both parties suffered so much. What's certain is that the crime destroyed several lives, especially the daughters. They continue to live knowing that they will never again see their father, and that their mother is responsible for that. Wherever they are, I hope the family finds some measure of peace. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.